Welcome to the What the Heck is Literature and Popular Culture presentation. I wanted to make a brief note up front that my camera, what I've done with my camera is freeze it, which means you just sort of see me grinning at you. And that makes it a little bit easier to record this and not have it lock up on me. So let's dive right in and let's answer that question first of all. What is a class about literature and popular culture? What does that mean? I talked about this a little bit in the welcome presentation, but I want to expand on that a bit. As I mentioned in the welcome presentation, we talk a lot about literature with a capital L. When we were in English classes, we talked about traditional texts, things like Moby Dick and Bleak House and the Things Fall Apart, and the things that you read when you were in English class. Hamlet, you could probably come up with a dozen different examples. What we do in a literature and popular culture class is take the practices that we've used in those more formal literature classes and apply them not just to works of popular fiction or other popular culture like movies or web things that exist on the web or music or drama or any other kind of form that you'd like to put in. But we apply those principles and those practices not just to the artworks, but also we use them to examine our culture. It's actually, in some ways, a very simple beginning. The premise of a literature and popular culture class is that popular literature is as valuable and as important, that literature with a small l is as valuable and as important as literature with a capital L. Sometimes it's even more valuable and important and worth studying and thinking about and working with than the things that we've traditionally studied. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to go and have a book burning and get rid of Moby Dick. Not that I've ever really read it, but it doesn't mean I'm going to have a book burning and get rid of all those wonderful other things and works of literature and art. What it means is that when we go into a literature and popular culture class, we expand our focus and we look at all the things that a society produces, its artifacts, its creations, and think about them as mirrors of that society. So why would we want to do that? Why is it even important or interesting to look at society, at our society, and look at ourselves? I mean, heck, we see ourselves every day. I think, and to sort of answer that question, I wanted to share with you two quotes. And they're both quite long, and I'm going to go through them pretty much line by line. But I want to start out by reading the first one. It's from Dr. Rosemary Weatherston. She has a website for her detective fiction class, and that's where this is taken from. I've taken some liberties with the physical layout of the text to make it more readable and to emphasize the points that I'm going to talk about. But let's listen to what she has to say. W.H. Auden begins his famous essay on detective fiction, The Guilty Vicarage, with a confession. Quote, "For me, as for many others, the reading of detective stories is an addiction like tobacco or alcohol." End quote. The idea that detective fiction is merely guilty pleasures, void of any artistic or social value, is as common as the stories themselves. Yet, as we will see over the course of the semester, literary and filmic detective fictions are ideal sites of artistic and cultural investigation. They are narratives about narrative and about how to read bodies, clues, contexts. They are texts given by questions of identity. Who is it? Who done it? Questions of epistemology. How do we know? What do we know? And questions of hermeneutics. How should we interpret and understand? Their characters and plots are driven by issues of power, crime, law, order, sex, desire, fear, death, anger, logic, rationality, insanity, politics, class, race, gender, guilt, innocence, marginality, agency, individuality, and society, just to name a few common themes. They can reflect, recuperate, or critique their cultural milieus, sometimes simultaneously. Guilty pleasures, perhaps, but in the richest and most ironic sense of the term. And I love this quote. I love what she has to say, because in basically a couple of paragraphs, she really nails down why, at least from my perspective, I think that detective fiction is such a great thing to study. That it really is this incredibly rich mine of information about who we are and what we think, and who past societies have been and what they've thought. So let's go back and look at this a little bit more. In this very first paragraph that I've created, if you go to her website, you'll see this is sort of the opening statement, and you'll see that this is all basically one big chunk. But anyway, in this very first paragraph, she has for us this quote about, that detective fiction is an addiction. And the thriller, the detective fiction, the pulp fiction, the film noir, these things have really frequently, as Weatherston points out, people look at these as pieces of disposable art. You read it, you throw it away. And to a certain extent, that is probably true. But we need to look at the craft of creating these kinds of stories and value it, because I think that as the semester goes on, we're going to really see a lot of incredible work that the authors are doing to keep us in suspense and to keep us guessing that we may not know the answer, to get us involved, to make us care, to make us terrified when we find when the dead body is found, and when there's the creeping menace, the fear of the unknown. There's a lot at work. What's interesting is already in the postings that many of you have done, you've talked about what it is in the authors that you read that really compels you, and that sense of, I can't put this book down. I know I have to work at 8 in the morning, as one of you wrote, but I'm going to read until 3 because I'm so compelled by the story. And for me, at least, I feel like the ability and the power to compel a reader so that they can't put it down is of incredible artistic value, but it also is incredibly revelatory about who we are, what drives us, what fascinates us, how can we be driven and fascinated, led, made to perceive things and learn things about our world. Okay. In the next paragraph, Weatherston talks about detective fiction being narratives about narrative. And what I'd like to suggest that she means here is, she says that detective fictions are stories about telling a story, because what they do is they lay out what I like to call the trail of breadcrumbs. We look at how do we lead our reader, how is the reader led forward so that they get from point A to point B, and they either believe or suspend disbelief in order to get to the point where they understand what's going on. So they're detective fiction is really useful because they are, in many ways, the pinnacle of the storytelling craft. They are the place where we can really look at how do stories get told. Okay, but she also says it's about how to read, and that's true. I mean, if you think about it, detective fiction is very much focused on how do we understand, how do we read? In other words, how do we look at and derive meaning from clues, from the environment, from people, from scraps of paper, from all the evidence that exists in whatever story we're being told. And I think that's another place where we're going to really find some fascinating stuff as we look at not just the books that I've assigned in this course, but the books that you're familiar with. One thing that came out even early on in your first postings is that there's this incredible wealth of literature that we're not reading in this class, and that some of you have read, particularly people like Dean Koontz and Stephen King. I'm going to talk about later in the semester Philip Pullman. He's the guy who wrote The Golden Compass. Even the Harry Potter books, all of these have elements of mystery uh, as we're going to talk about it over the course of the semester. Now, let's look at her next paragraph, because I think there are three terms here. There's three pieces of terminology that we're going to revisit again and again because they're really useful. One is, it says, detective fiction texts are driven by questions of identity. So who is it? Who is it that committed this crime? What does a murderer look like? And I don't just mean their physical appearance, obviously, but what does it take? What's the motivation? Why did somebody do it? What's going on? That we're really looking at identity. Also, we're looking at the identity of who solves the mystery, what empowers them to do it, or how are they able to get where they go? What kind of obstacles do they face? There's a book that we are not going to read this semester. Boy, is that a long list? Called The Caveman's Valentine, which has as its detective a schizophrenic homeless man who lives in a cave in a park. It's just a great book and a great movie, actually. And it's really fascinating to see how that plays with the identity of the detective and issues of power and things like that. But I think that these questions of identity are another place where we're really going to spend a lot of time looking at the victims, the perpetrators, and the detectives that we come across. Then we look at questions of this word epistemology. And epistemology is the science or the study or the philosophy of how we know and what do we know. In other words, what is it that allows us to uncover and understand the truth? Okay? And then the question of hermeneutics. How should we interpret and understand? So we get this body of knowledge. And what does it mean on a small scale, on a larger scale, and on a grand scale? So we'll be looking, these are terms that are going to come up again and again. And so I'm just going to throw them out there. Actually, I had Dr. Rosemary do it for you, but she's put this down. Now, she has a little laundry list in her next paragraph about some of the themes that are really common in detective fiction. I think about, as I was reading this list, I was thinking about an old John Grisham novel, which is called The Pelican Brief, and you may have read the book or seen the movie. And so many, and that's a book that deals a lot with the legal framework within which corporations get to do really bad things. And that's actually a focus of Grisham's work, as you probably know if you're a fan of his. But anyway, she has this laundry list, and I would challenge you to think about any of the books of popular detective fiction that you've read, and see how so many of these themes are present. And these are key themes. These are things that excite us and terrify us and fascinate us. And they're issues that are very present in our lives, in our society. How do we deal with these issues is one of the greatest reflections of who we are as a society. Okay, so this is a great laundry list, and we'll probably come back to this too. In her last paragraph, she says they can reflect. In other words, detective fiction can reflect, and that's what we've been talking about. It can really reflect our society. Recuperate, and what recuperate means is if a society or a culture can have it has a bad, is seen in a negative light or is seen as being worthless, detective fiction can actually ennoble it, or can put it in a positive light, or it can critique their cultural milieus. And a milieu is a circle, a group, a cultural group, or identity. And I want to give a great example of that. There's a wonderful series of detective novels by a Native American writer named Tony Hillerman. And in that, he gives a real window into Navajo culture. They're set in the desert Southwest, and they're just wonderful in terms of how they give us a way in to that culture, so that we're involved with it on a level that we wouldn't have been before. And many of Hillerman's readers may have had a negative perception or been completely ignorant about Native American culture in the Southwest and the history and the rituals and all the the conflicts that culture faces. But by reading Hillerman's novels, it's not like you become an expert, but you really get a much stronger sense and respect for that culture. And that's an example of recuperations. And yet at the same time, he also critiques that culture and some of the choices that aspects of the culture have made. But you're able to do this at one and the same time. What I want to do now, and if this doesn't scroll down when you're watching it, you'll be able to scroll down, use the sidebar to scroll down to get to our next quote. And this is on 2 pages, so we'll have to scroll down before. But if you scroll to the end, you can see this is something that was put together by R.D. Towery. This person was a graduate student at the School of Information and Library Science at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Just letting you know that. And this is another longish quote. And gosh darn it, there's good old W.H. Auden again in his Guilty Vicarage. This is seen as one of the seminal or foundational readings on detective fiction. And I'll be introducing that into the class and to reading a little bit later in the semester. Anyway, so let's start out with that quote from W.H. Auden, and then we'll see what Mr. Towery has to say about a little bit of history and background. Detective story. The basic formula is this. A murder occurs. Many are suspected. All but one suspect, who is the murderer, are eliminated. The murderer is arrested or dies. Now, you know very well there are variations on this theme, but that's a really good that's a really good little summation of here's the basic formula. Okay. Now we're going to go on and read a little bit more. The detective story is surprisingly young, and though many elements of the genre, such as deductive reasoning, are found in earlier works, the first story to feature a fictional detective wasn't created until the 19th century. Who done it? Well, Edgar Allan Poe, according to most, though he did use the short story form instead of the novel. Many people find it odd that this very British genre was invented by an American. Of course, the novels themselves deal in unlikelihoods, so it is only appropriate that the detective story's beginning be somewhat surprising and unexpected. After Poe, it was mainly British authors, such as Wilkie Collins, Charles Dickens, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who ushered the form through the 19th century, though there were some American and even French contributors too. In the early 20th century, Doyle continued to write and was joined by several British women, Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, Niall Marsh, and Marjorie Allingham, who all impacted the genre and wrote during what is called the form's golden age. After World War II, the genre morphed into somewhat different forms, such as the hard-boiled detective novel, though some of the golden age style of writings did continue and were typically referred to as cozies. Modern day sees something of a second golden age, with detective stories on bestseller lists in theaters and television programs. A number of variations, such as the hard-boiled detective novel, the police procedural, and spy novels, fractured off from the form at various points and have grown into genres of their own, though this seems to be more the case in America than in Britain. Though no matter where or how, the key elements of a clever detective, a crime, and justice prevailing continues to somehow unite these very different forms and keep the detective genre alive. And that's a nice, simple round of sort of what we're looking at. I think one of the incredible advantages of this genre, I think, is that it is young and that we have a relatively limited body of work to study. And that it might be interesting to ask, is there a relationship between, are there certain components of modern life and people who do history look at modern life, quote unquote, starting all the way back in the Renaissance, that we start seeing the evolution of modern life. But are there things in modern life, in the modern world, that make this form possible? Why does it arise at this time? And these are some questions that we'll look at a little bit. But I wanted to focus on a couple of things. I think one thing to bear in mind is this thing that Towery states, which is that while Murders in the Rue Morgue is generally seen as the first detective novel or story, the first detective story as we understand it. So many of the plot elements that existed in earlier times or exist in earlier times. We could go back, we could start unraveling back and go and look at where are the seeds of the modern detective novel, and we could go back very far in written fiction and probably find a lot of things, a lot of roots of this. And there's, one example I like to use is actually the novel Jane Eyre, which has very strong components of mystery. And also, any of you who are familiar with Gothic fiction, this is something that is prevalent earlier in the century, earlier in the 19th century, late 18th century. You see people Gothic fiction evolving. If you remember Frankenstein, I'm not sure how many people have to read that anymore, but that's a good example of some of this. We could find some of the seeds of this genre. One thing to know, however, is that fiction itself, as a totality, where people sat down and read books for entertainment or for instruction, that fiction itself is not that old. When you look at the rise of the novel, as we understand it, a modern novel, we're talking about a history. I beg your pardon. That does not go back that far, and that's the topic of another course. But it's something worth knowing. So we're dealing with a relatively young form. In the second paragraph, he mentioned some great names of people I would highly recommend. He talks about Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens has a couple of novels which are considered mysteries. One of them that's absolutely outstanding is called Our Mutual Friend. If you're a fan of Charles Dickens, and you like to read kind of books that can also be used as doorstops or paperweights, that's a great one. It's just tremendous, and it has a mystery of stolen identity and murder and all kinds of stuff. It's great. Wilkie Collins, he also mentions, wrote a wonderful book called The Moonstone, which is told from multiple narrators and also has in this case the crime is a theft, but it's same kind of, you'll recognize the modern detective story in that book. We know about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and we're going to be reading him later. He's the creator of Sherlock Holmes. But then he mentions some women writers: Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, Ngaio Marsh, and Marjorie Allingham. Many of you are familiar, either you read or your parents or grandparents read Agatha Christie. Dorothy Sayers is a wonderful writer. She has a couple novels that are really worth reading, and she has a famous detective named Lord Peter Wimsey, and I'm trying to think, she has a story called The Nine Tailors, another one called Gaudy Night, and another one called Murder Must Advertise. Really interesting snapshots of academic life for women, of the advertising business in the 1920s, all kinds of just really fascinating. It's like looking out a window into a really well-rendered room. Ngaio Marsh writes a lot about the theater and has is just a tremendous creator of characters. Somebody you might also enjoy. One of her novels that come to mind now is called A Night at the Vulcan, which is set in. It's not about Dr. Spock from from Star Trek. It's set in a theater, and it's fascinating. I wanted to also look at this term. Towery talks about how the genre evolves as the society in which it's set evolves and different challenges arise. But he uses this term in the back, or at the end of that second paragraph, which is the term cozies. And a cozy is another term for the kind of mystery that we call the locked room. How could this happen? Everybody was in a locked room and the guy ended up dead. Nobody could have gotten to him. That kind of traditional mystery where you have the crime is committed, the guy comes in, or the detective comes in, unravels the case, interviews everybody, and then says, "I have an answer." Okay, we're actually going to be reading a cozy later on, and that's going to be called "Death of an Expert Witness," and you'll kind of see how those unravel, and they're fascinating, right? I also wanted to look at this point that Towery makes in his final paragraph. He looks at he says that that this overarching genre, detective fiction, has now fractured into a number of different smaller genres, like the hard-boiled detective novel, and we are going to be reading one of those, Farewell, My Lovely, which is also hysterically funny in places. I think you're going to enjoy it a lot. And then he talks about spy novels and the police procedural, and that's another term that I wanted to give to you. A police procedural is just what it sounds like. It basically is focused. The detective is not a private eye or a private person, but a police officer or police detective. And he's somebody who follows the procedures and the practices that the police use in order to unravel the case. Obviously, Law and Order is a great example of the TV show, and CSI, all the various versions of CSI, is another example. Those are police procedurals because you're really looking at the police detectives or at how scientists unravel this using the tools that are given to that group of people. But the point is that I've sort of stuck with a broader definition of the detective novel for the purposes of this class, but you could just focus on one of those little genres and spend 2 semesters or 5 semesters and never reach the end of it. But fortunately, we have reached the end of this presentation. I've been talking throughout about various things that we're going to be focusing on. You've got some terminology, you got some history, you got some reason for why Anna thinks this is such a big deal and so worth spending a semester on. And I hope that this has been helpful to you as a start of the class. Please